My cat, a quiet kitty, jumped over the fence and stayed for a few minutes in the neighbor's yard. Any normal person would just ignore it or give it back, but not this woman. She called the police claiming criminal trespass and tried to make me pay a nuisance fine. If there's one thing I've learned living in this neighborhood, it's that there's always someone willing to turn anything normal into a problem. This time, the target was my cat. Yes, my cat. A four-legged furry animal that spends 90% of its time sleeping, and the other 10% trying to decide whether to ignore me or tolerate me. The story begins on a Saturday morning, one of those perfect days. The sun was shining, the weather was pleasant, and I was quietly enjoying my coffee while watching my cat, Tobias, take his classic morning stroll around the yard. He's an explorer by birth, always curious, always venturing a little beyond the territory I'd like. And that's when it happened. He jumped over the fence and ended up in the neighbor's yard. Any normal person would simply pick up the cat and return it to her. Maybe even pet it first. But not this woman. Oh no, that would have been too easy. It was only a matter of minutes before I heard a high-pitched scream, the kind that usually indicates that someone has found a flying cockroach in the bathroom. I ran to see what was going on, and, to my utter disbelief, there was the neighbor, standing in her yard, as if she had just caught a serial killer. But the villain? Tobias, the cat. He was lying lazily on her lawn, in no hurry to get out of there. The woman pointed at him with an expression of horror, as if she were dealing with a wild bear invading her property. "Your cat is in my yard!" she shouted, her voice filled with indignation. I blinked a few times, hoping the sentence would make more sense, but it didn't. I looked at Tobias, who was completely oblivious to the drama, licking a paw with the serenity of someone who doesn't give a damn about human problems. "Okay," I replied, still trying to understand the level of madness I was dealing with. She started gesticulating as if she was about to collapse. She said that animals couldn't invade private property, that this was a home invasion, and that I was irresponsible for allowing such a thing. All this while Tobias yawned. At first, I thought it was a passing exaggeration, but then she pulled out her cell phone and started dialing a number. And that's when I realized that things were about to get completely out of hand. The scene was so absurd that it took my brain a while to process. The woman, still looking like she had just caught a heinous crime, was typing on her cell phone with an urgency that I imagined was reserved for real emergencies. But no, she was actually calling the police. For a second, I thought maybe she was pretending just to scare me. But no, she was taking it seriously. While she was waiting to be attended to, she started walking around in circles in her yard, huffing and throwing disgusted glances at Tobias, who, poor thing, was still completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to be booked as a high-risk criminal. The cat, by the way, didn't even seem to notice the commotion. He was lying on the grass, occasionally stretching out and changing position as if testing the best angles for a nap. It wasn't until I heard her saying the words trespassing and aggressive animal to the attendant on the other end of the line that I realized this story was going too far. She spoke as if a hungry lion had jumped over the fence and was about to devour half the neighborhood. I looked at Tobias. He yawned and went back to sleep. Yes, clearly a violent and dangerous animal. After hanging up, the woman crossed her arms and stared at me with that superior look, as if she had just done society a great favor, as if, at that very moment, she was preventing a crime of epic proportions. I could have taken Tobias and ended it there, but you know what? Part of me wanted to see how far it would go. The level of insanity was so great that I felt almost obliged to watch this story unfold. And then, 10 minutes later, a car did indeed appear on the street. 2 policemen got out of the car, and the neighbor practically ran up to them, gesticulating frantically as she pointed at the four-legged criminal. The most impressive thing? She seemed to really believe she was right. The officers, who were probably expecting to deal with something real, took a few seconds to understand that they were there to resolve a territorial dispute between a paranoid woman and a cat who had no idea what was going on. One of the officers looked at me, then at Tobias, who was still lying in the same place, and then at the neighbor, who was talking as if she were reporting a bank robbery. His expression said it all. Why did I choose this profession? But the best part was yet to come, because, against all odds, they really began to treat it as a legitimate calling. And that's when it got even more absurd. If one day I had to imagine the most ridiculous scene possible involving law enforcement, it would never come close to what was happening there. Two policemen, a notepad, an indignant neighbor, and at the center of it all, Tobias, a cat who at that moment was more interested in cleaning his own paw than in his supposed criminal history. The woman continued to pour out her litany, gesticulating as if she had caught an international trafficking scheme. She said it wasn't just a cat in her yard, but a security threat. She claimed that Tobias could be carrying diseases, that he could be aggressive, and that, above all, it was a home invasion. Yes, a home invasion. One of the policemen, who already seemed to be questioning all the choices that had led him to this point in his life, sighed deeply and looked at me. His partner, trying to maintain a modicum of professionalism, was jotting down a few things on his notepad. Apparently, Tobias was about to have a criminal record. I could have solved everything right there. I could have simply picked Tobias up and put an end to the clowning. But by then, the situation had turned into such a wonderful theater of the absurd that I wanted to see how it would end. The woman, realizing that she needed an even more convincing argument, decided to appeal to the emotional. She said that she had a real fear of cats, and that Tobias's presence caused her unbearable stress. This, of course, while she was less than a meter away from the cat, who didn't even deign to open his eyes to acknowledge her existence. The policeman, taking notes, looked at his partner, then at me, and finally turned to her. "Ma'am, has the cat left your yard yet?" The question was a watershed, because at that moment, Tobias, with absolutely perfect timing, decided he was bored of the neighbor's lawn and came back to my side without any haste, without any consideration for the chaos he had caused. He just jumped over the fence back into the house, sat down and started licking himself, as if he was cleaning up any trace of the human idiocy he had had to deal with. The neighbor went mute. For the first time, she realized that her affair was falling apart. But of course, she wasn't going to give up so easily. She looked at me, then at the policeman, and then, with an air of forced victory, she unleashed the worst threat of all. "I'm going to take this to City Hall." Yes, she wanted to involve the government in this, and, honestly, I couldn't wait to see how far this insanity would go. If you think logic would return to this story, I'm sorry. The neighbor really took the threat seriously, and decided that the next step in her crusade against my cat would be to get the city government involved. The most impressive thing was her dedication. The next day, I received an official email from the city's animal control department. At first, I thought it was a hoax, but no. The woman had actually filed a formal complaint claiming that Tobias was an invasive animal and that I should be held responsible for him. I didn't know what was more absurd, the fact that she had wasted her time doing this, or the fact that someone in the town hall had read it and thought, yes, this deserves to be registered. In the same email, I was informed that an inspector would pay a visit to assess the situation. In other words, someone with a badge and a clipboard would come to my house to investigate whether my cat, a being that weighs less than a sack of rice, was a public threat. And so, 2 days later, a middle-aged man, looking like he had seen everything in his life, appeared at my door. He was holding some papers and greeted me with a look of sheer exhaustion. I asked him to come in, and then he began to explain, in the most robotic tone possible, that he needed to check whether Tobias posed a risk of reoffending. Yes, they used the word recidivism to describe a cat that had taken the wrong nap. As he spoke, Tobias emerged from the kitchen, walked quietly over to the sofa, and lay down, completely oblivious to the fact that he was being investigated by the government. The inspector looked at him, looked at me, and let out a long sigh, the kind that carries years of professional frustration. He took out a sheet of paper and began to read the neighbor's allegations. Some of the pearls included, "The cat invaded my property without permission." Of course, because everyone knows that cats sign contracts before going for a walk. It could be spreading disease. Funny that she never had a problem with the birds and squirrels in her yard. It made my blood pressure go up with nerves. If that was a crime, what about rush hour traffic? After a few minutes of filling in the paperwork, he simply looked at me and said, "I have to ask, do you think you can keep the cat from getting out of the yard?" The ideal answer would have been, "Oh, sure, I'll sit down with him and explain the rules of society." But, for some reason, I didn't think sarcasm would help. I replied that I would try to keep Tobias inside more often, and he nodded, clearly just wanting to get it over with. He filled in one last form and said that the case would probably be dropped. But before he left, he made a final comment that made me laugh alone afterwards. "Look, I've dealt with bizarre complaints before, but this is new." And with that, Tobias was officially cleared by the government. But the neighbor wasn't going to accept this defeat so easily. After the inspector's visit, I thought the story had finally come to an end. Tobias had been cleared. The city government had clearly realized that it was all a big joke, and I was ready to get on with my life without having to deal with any more insanity. But, as always, I underestimated this woman's ability to take things too far. 3 days later, as I was leaving for work, I noticed a piece of paper taped to my door. A formal notice from the neighborhood association. Do you know what her new invention was? A petition to ban Tobias from the neighborhood? Yes, she decided that, since the police and the town hall had done nothing, it was time to take the case to the Supreme Court of old neighborhood gossips. In the document, she claimed that my cat was a continual nuisance and suggested that he be banned from the neighborhood, as if Tobias were a juvenile delinquent in need of a court order to keep his distance from society. Best or worst of all, some people signed it, not because they agreed, but because nobody wanted to argue with this woman. She was the type who knocked on people's doors at 7 in the morning, demanding signatures and threatening to report anyone who refused. I decided that I had put up with enough of this madness. I took the petition and did exactly what any sensible person would do. I scanned it and posted it online. The title of the post? "My neighbor wants to deport my cat." Within hours, the post went viral. People from all over the world were commenting on the absurdity of the situation, laughing at the idea of a cat being treated like an escaped criminal. Some suggested that I make a passport for Tobias, with an official stamp of permanent residence in the neighborhood. Others said we should make a statue to honor the first cat in the world to almost be banished from a neighborhood. The repercussion was so great that it reached some local newspapers. A news website ran a short story about the cat expelled from his own town, and a local radio station approached me to find out if the story was real. When the neighbor realized that her name was being dragged around the internet, she went into full panic mode. From one moment to the next, she tore up the petitions, tried to pretend nothing had happened, and started avoiding any eye contact with me. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she had overreacted a little. A lot. And Tobias? Well, he was still a cat. I didn't even know he was an internet icon. The last time I saw the woman, she crossed the street to avoid me, which is great. Because honestly, after all this, I was expecting her to try to sue me for illegal cat storage. Moral of the story: if you want to live in peace, never underestimate someone's ability to turn a simple cat into a national security problem. Have you ever had to deal with a crazy neighbor who thinks she runs the world? Let us know in the comments. And if you like this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like for more stories like this. Want more absurdities like this? Click on the card and let's watch. See you in the next video.